Good afternoon, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the International Workshop, Ensuring Food Security Under Climate Crisis. This symposium has simultaneous interpretation available. If you prefer Japanese, please select Japanese from the interpretation button in your Zoom window. このシンポジウムは日本語の同時通訳を用意しております。日本語で視聴したい方は、Zoom ウィンドウの下にございます通訳ボタンをクリックし、日本語をお選びください。Thank you once again for joining us from all over the world. This symposium is co-hosted by IGES, Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, and SDGs unit of the Institute for Future Initiatives, the University of Tokyo. This symposium is broadcasted from a conference room in Hayama, where the headquarters of IGES is located. The symposium will be 3.5 hours long, with 2 sessions and 1 intermission between the sessions. Please click on the link to today's program in your Zoom chat box shared just now if you would like to see the details. So my name is Kei Kurushima, a policy researcher of adaptation and water area in IGES, and it is my great pleasure to be acting as a moderator of the first session. Today we have a number of speakers presenting, and due to time constraints, we cannot collect questions from the audience. Please accept our arrangement. When you close the Zoom window, even in the middle of the symposium or after the symposium, Zoom will present you with a survey about your experience today. We would appreciate your feedback to help us improve our webinars. Finally, the presentation material and the recording of the symposium will be uploaded on the website about a week after today. Before we begin the session, I have one unfortunate announcement. Dr. Aditi Mukherjee of CGIAR was originally scheduled to give us a keynote speech here, but due to circumstances, she will not be able to join us today. We are now trying to figure out a way to get her video messages, and if it is successful, we will be uploading this video on our website. However, we have invited experts from diverse backgrounds to this event, and we hope you will enjoy their presentations and discussions. As administrative information, the start time of session 1 will be shifted. However, we will adjust the time for session 2, including breaks, so that we can start session 2 at the scheduled time. This international workshop is organized by the Food Security Research Team of the newly developed project, Asia Pacific Climate Security Project, or we call it APCS project. This project is funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Japan, and as IGES being the leading organization of this project, we collaborate with relevant organizations and work on various research topics related to climate security with the aim of identifying threats to climate security and making policy recommendations to address them. Before I invite the speakers for the first session, I would like to explain briefly about this APCS project and what the Food Security Research Team are doing. Okay. Okay, so this is the overview of the climate security. So in the Asia Pacific region, there are climate changes that is posing security risks. Climate security is a widely discussed topic over the world. And this APCS project led by IGES especially focus on the Asia Pacific region on the climate security issues. So climate change has been transforming the international security environment, and in the Asia Pacific region has also been facing various climate security risks, such as frequent and severe climate-related disasters. And policies to tackle climate change as a global agenda could also have implications and impacts for the regional order. And this is the focus of the APCS project. Okay, so this is just a figure showing our research interest. So we are working on the nexus of climate change and security issues with focusing on compound and cascading risks on climate change. As climate security has a multifaceted analysis, we focus on 5 sub-themes, which are energy, food, migration, adaptation, and ocean. Today's workshop is organized by the food sub-theme, which is the second sub-theme written in this figure. And we also focus on the multi-layered security environment from human security, national security, regional security, and international security. So I would like to explain about this food security sub-theme. And we work on food security under climate change. So this is the overview of our team and focus. So in our team, we have 3 members, Dr. Naoyuki Okano from IGES, and Dr. Nazia Hussain from University of Tokyo, and I from IGES. Our research question is, how will climate change affect the balance of food security? And we will approach this question from both institutional and practical perspective with a political approach. Based on the team's expertise, we have 3 themes, which are land, water, and international norm making. So for conflicts over land and water, it is essential for agricultural production, and the security threatens the food security, and these risks are increasing due to climate change. For the research on international norm making, international policy formation on food security will be examined, and implications from research in each region will be linked to international discussions. We have just began this research from this fiscal year, and we will be developing this political approach from our expertise into a framework for food security in the following 2 years. Okay, so this is the end of the opening presentation to introduce about our project. So next, I would like to proceed to session 1, titled Dynamics of Food Security Under Climate Change. Okay. So we have 4 speakers lined up for this session as shown on the screen. And we will begin with a framing presentation by my collaborator, Dr. Nazia Hussain, followed by presentations from our guest speakers. We will have panel discussions after the presentations. Dr. Nazia Hussain is an assistant professor at the Institute for Future Initiatives, the University of Tokyo, and she has been collaborating with this research project since last year. So Nazia-san, your please.
Thank you, Kuroshima-san. If we could put up my presentation. Thank you, great. Thank you. It's a pleasure to join all of you. I will be presenting our framing presentation on behalf of Dr. Kei Kuroshima and myself. I will begin with basic facts, which I think all of us know, but bear repeating anyway. FAO defines food security in terms of availability, that is, sufficient quality food is available through domestic production or imports, access, which means to adequate entitlements, utilization of food, and then stability of food. These are also some very basic facts. Half of the food insecure people in the world live in Asia Pacific. More than 1 billion people in 2021 experienced food insecurity, and half of them were living here. And we see the regions South Asia, Southeast Asia, Oceania, and East Asia. Some disturbing figures, which you may see on the screen: 23% of the children experienced stunted growth, 32.9% of women had anemia and such. Lastly, that the average cost of nutritious food was almost $4 per person per day, while 44.5% of the population in Asia and Pacific could not afford this. So these are disturbing facts indeed. Climate risks to agriculture and food systems in Asia are escalating according to latest estimates by scientists, and they will continue to do so. Major projected impacts include decline in fisheries, aquaculture, crop production, reduction in livestock production, changes in crop farming systems, and crop areas in almost all regions with negative implications. And we see this happening around us in India, in Cambodia, in top Asian rice-producing countries, in South Asia, monsoon floods, for instance, and in Pakistan very recently. So I think we are well aware of what is happening, but just seeing them together. Now in a very simple graphic, that climate systems are impacting food production, food systems, and these effects are translated into our socioeconomic systems. And then, of course, that adaptation and mitigation measures can perhaps nullify some of the effects and contribute to food security. This is the dominant framing that we see. I would just like to read the quote here because I think it bears repeating again. In the IPCC 2022 report, the statement was, agriculture and the food system are key to global climate change responses, combining supply-side actions such as efficient production, transport, and processing with demand-side interventions such as modification of food choices and reduction of food loss and waste, reduces greenhouse gas emissions, and enhances food system resilience. And this is something which makes sense. It's very logical. But when we go in literature, we see that food is not just a commodity, and techno-corporate solutions doubling food production are not the golden key to food security. Concepts like food sovereignty and food justice approaches argue for more control over food production and consumption by people marginalized by mainstream agri-food regimes. Secondly, that there should be equity in decision-making and distribution of resources rather than processes that merely extract value. In the graphic, which I will not go in detail, you can see that we have to think about actors, you have to think about many different aspects when you think about food justice and food sovereignty. And then secondly, that climate change is not the only cause of food insecurity. Food insecurity, including any crisis for that matter, results from distribution and markets that create conditions where low-income populations are unable to access enough food. You also need to think about legal resources. You need to think about social networks of support, which can lead to food insecurity among populations. And we know this because we have literature going back, decades. So in addition to the biophysical aspects of climate change that we should pay attention to, we also need to pay attention to the social, political, economic decisions, processes, and systems that create vulnerability. Then we should remember that social ecological systems are cascaded across time and space. What I mean is that the impact of climate change may be felt in localized spaces, but then the impact of climate change may travel over space and time because of our interconnected, globalized systems. So for instance, winter drought in 2011 in China's wheat growing regions somehow made its way to Egypt, the world's largest wheat importer, where high food and bread prices combined with pre-existing grievances in the society coincided with the Arab Spring. So what do we have here? It would be easy to say that perhaps there's, you can do research about all this. But one of the important things to think about is that even within research, you have a lot of intellectual dissonance. What do I mean by that? Firstly, bottom up. You have case studies which focus on past and present vulnerabilities, which focus on contexts. And then you have top-down approaches, which may model climate projections with assessments and provide you the big picture. But there's a disconnect between the bottom-up and top-down. And bottom-up proponents, the case study proponents, may find that their approach is better, and top-down approaches, which are doing 20, 50 case studies, may find that their approach is better. But what is the middle path? How can both inform each other? Then you have to think about resilience approaches. Resilience approaches focus on producing sufficient and nutritious food in the face of chronic environmental perturbations. So they'll talk about increased diversity of crop types in a rotation, or better seeds, or whatever have you, biotechnological approaches. But then on the other hand, you have critical approaches which focus on decommodifying food and raising the question of democratic control over land and water by ordinary people, as opposed to corporatization of agriculture. And they make the point that probing into deeper issues linked with inequities of food production and food access is very important. Then you have human security approaches, which reflect a discursive shift in climate security debates to human security, which is essentially about human dignity and well-being, and thus it allows greater acknowledgement of agrarian struggles vis-a-vis climate. But even within the human security approach, we have implicit assumptions about resource scarcity, managing possible conflicts, overlooking structural processes exacerbating climate change, and so on. So who's right and who is wrong? We're not saying any approach is right or any approach is wrong. The point we're making is that all of us are trying to understand this, and perhaps the efforts are piecemeal, and we need to find a way to interact with each other. We need resilience and we need critical approaches. We need top-down approaches and bottom-up approaches. But at the moment, we're talking at each other and not with each other. What is at stake? I just want to remind everyone that it's not just, the academic debates and confrontations are not just about academia. These have real world implications. We have land issues which are central to food and agriculture. We're seeing urbanization processes which are driving changes in agri-food systems across the rural-urban continuum. We have pressure on renewable water resources, which will remain severe and would even exacerbate when urbanization processes lead to increasing claims on water resources. One way forward, which as the slide says, it's just one way, there can be many other ways. One is identifying the elephant in the room, which is, depending on analytical approaches, the same concept may mean different things to different people. So we need to have deeper conversations on analytical foundations shaping research. We need to bring together academics across analytical divides to think about shared concepts and vocabularies. And then we need to develop research projects which involve multiple analytical approaches. Secondly, that we need to think relationally, not just in terms of top-down or bottom-up, but how the two shape each other. Generalized models and big picture theoretical arguments are important, but they could be nuanced by historical, cultural, and local knowledge in different parts of the world. Similarly, keeping an eye on generalizable insights from case studies is important. We need context, but we need to see how something may play out in another context. Lastly, bringing together academics, activists, and practitioners for mutual teaching and learning to inspire deeper understanding and dialogue. And what I mean by that is that as academics, we may be looking at something which may really mean something else to a practitioner or to an activist. So there need to be conversations among all of us. Lastly, I will briefly introduce our ongoing research by the food security team. Land being focused on by Dr. Kei Kuroshima, who is focusing on land security in Bangladesh and in the Philippines. And then water resources by myself, where urbanization processes, by which I mean infrastructure and real estate development, are encroaching upon agricultural land ecosystems and water resources. And my case studies are Karachi, Pakistan, and Manila, Philippines. And we're doing this research in collaboration with local scholars in all these countries. Lastly, that the work we're trying to do is collaborative. We're focusing on different aspects, but they inform each other. And this work funded by IJES is groundbreaking in that respect, and we hope that others would follow suit. Thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions or comments.
Thank you, Nazia-san. I think the framing presentations was useful to think about like the variety of approaches in food security and how working with each other is important. So before having our speakers present, we got an image that the food security is a very broad and interdisciplinary approach topic. Okay, so next I would like to invite our three guest speakers to give us their presentations. Our first distinguished speaker is Dr. Brianna Castro. And Dr. Castro is an assistant professor of sociology and climate studies at Vanderbilt University in the United States. This was, the floor is yours, Brianna.
Thank you very much, Kurishima-san and Nazia-san, for your presentation today. I'm very happy to be here with all of you in Hayama. And today I'll be talking about my work on everyday adaptation and the implications that has for food security in the changing climate. As you said, I'm Brianna Castro. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, in the USA. I'm a sociologist by training and environmental sociologist specifically. Sorry, this is a little hard to see, but I'll pull it up here. So I do research in three broad areas as a sociologist. Broadly, I work on the social effects of climate change. My main focus is climate change adaptation and also climate change migration and mobility. I also look at the society-environment relationship through governance structures. I work on land tenure, climate governance, and conservation policy as well. For my research methods, I do very deep field research. I do in-depth interviews, participant observation. I also do surveys and focus groups, but I spend a lot of time in communities impacted by climate change. The bulk of my research is in 3 locations: in Lagos, Nigeria, in rural Colombia, South America, which I'll speak about today, and in coastal North Carolina in the United States. I also collaborate on teams or projects in Borneo, Indonesia, in Central America, and on the Gulf Coast of the US, and I'll draw on all of that work today. So the argument I want to make to you all, rather than focus on one specific paper or project, is that individual climate change adaptations affect food security, that they are important for and can tell us something about food security as these individual adaptations aggregate over time. So I'll start by defining what I mean by individual everyday adaptation. Then I'll talk about some lessons from everyday adaptation for food security, and then opportunities for policy synergies to support both adaptation and food security derived from my micro level research. So beginning with everyday adaptation, I study adaptation as a social process. One of the questions that was offered to us to consider today for this workshop is what may be some entry points regarding interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary scholarship to think about food security. So I offer this research as an example of how considering the social impacts of climate change from the bottom up can offer insights to environmental policy and science related to top-down approaches to food security itself. So I'm interested in theorizing how people adjust their lives to climate impacts in different contexts, especially contexts with low formalized adaptation support and planning, because I believe that tells us what individuals are most likely to do as the climate changes and what could be supported through policy. So based on my field research across these sites, my colleague and I, Raka Sen, define everyday adaptation as localized individual responses to living in a changing climate. That includes how people shift their routines, their work, how they change their preparedness and their livelihoods and their values in relation to gradual climate change around them. So we consider how individuals and households adapt to climate change in their everyday life at the micro level. And then we also consider how institutional context influences this micro level adaptation action. Often we talk about adaptation as a policy process coming into communities, but it's important to consider that everyone is adapting every day in their work and their lives, and that those small actions, I argue, aggregate to something larger that impacts policy. So these are some general categories of everyday adaptation that I look at in my work, from preparedness to routine maintenance to livelihoods and routines. I won't go through this today, but I just wanted to give an example of many of the actions that are available and that I find in my work. So now I'll go through 4 examples from considering everyday adaptation that are important to understanding food security. The first is shifting outdoor work routines in extreme heat. So some of my research with a large team in Borneo, Indonesia, considered outdoor workers' practices in agriculture, both in forested and non-forested agricultural areas, while measuring temperatures through multiple temperature monitors, including wet bulbs, to understand what shifts when heat is extreme. So we found that these workers took more frequent and longer breaks and intense heat, that they shifted their work times to earlier in the day and later in the evening in this extreme heat. And that these actions over time has an important food security impact, which is lower overall yields in planting and harvesting, which means less food produced overall. So if we're thinking about operationalizing this for policy synergies, some adaptation used, some adaptations used in forested areas. Sorry, I can't see this. Okay. Some adaptations were used in both areas, but the majority were much more successful in forested agricultural areas than non-forested agricultural areas. So that might have some implications for policy action. For example, supporting increased shaded agriculture could be one. Studying outdoor workers' hours or shifting them through policy to cooler times of day could be another. And supporting research on the cooling services of forests more broadly and the importance of forest quality for these cooling services could be another, to protect food security and productivity in extreme heat. And these are just some graphics from that paper if you want to take a look. The second one that I'll speak about is A transition to more resilient crops that produce quickly in smallholder farms through rural Colombia. So in Colombia, as drought has increased and seasons have become less predictable, farmers are shifting to planting bananas, planting fruit trees and fruit vines, and they're planting less staple crops like tubers. And they explain this in terms of the difficulty in relying on traditional staple crops like tubers that have a long growing season and require certain amounts of water that can't be expected or sustained as climate variability increases. In North Carolina, there's a similar transition happening among farmers from planting sweet potatoes and soy to planting cotton because that's more resilient to hurricanes and more salt tolerant. So the food security impact here is that there's changing food availability in areas as many smallholder farmers shift what they grow, and there's less planting of staple crops that are traditionally part of standard diets. So one opportunity for policy synergy here is to increase food system resilience by supporting planting and harvesting of diverse resilient crops, availability of resilient crops, as well through providing drought, flood, and or salt tolerant seed varieties. So policy ideas to respond to this might be providing seeds for diverse resilient crops, monetary support for failed harvests of staple crops to encourage continuing to plant staple crops needed for the food system, and research on what plants are successful in extreme climate conditions at the very localized level, from increased salt in the soil to higher variability in rainfall. And this is fairly consistent with what you might see from the resilience perspective, like Nazia-san spoke about before. And here are some pictures from fieldwork of farmers explaining things that they've shifted, including a woman who works in aquaculture traditionally that shifted to roasting peanuts because of aquaculture being less dependable. The third example I'll speak to is increased mobility among smallholder farmers in pursuit of viable land for planting, and also shifting land that is planted or left dormant according to climate conditions. These are two examples of increased mobility I'm seeing across the places where I work in response to climate extremes. Rural farmers have moved and rented parcels from others where rain is more likely than the drier areas where they may have tenured land throughout rural Colombia. This has an important food security impact because it means local food markets are becoming less predictable. So an opportunity for policy synergy here would be translocal social support systems when farmers move from one area of land to another temporarily or seasonally in search of more productive harvests. Policy ideas that would support this movement over the long term is communal land tenure and increased tenure security so that farmers feel secure leaving the land that they own or own without secure tenure in order to farm elsewhere during times of drought or water shortage. In my field work, something interesting that you see are these temporary wood structures that farmers build and move around to different areas of land to try planting for short-term periods rather than stay in their permanent homes. I also have had farmers and households sit down and draw out the different places that they've moved in a season or over multiple seasons. And you can see on the left a map of how many movements they capture, and this is typical of seasonal mobility for farming. This was not something happening 5 years before. It's new. And the last practice that I'll speak to today is farmers transitioning from cattle to small livestock in response to protracted drought and unpredictable rainfall. This has an important security impact because it's a shifting supply of livestock available in local food economies. But an opportunity for synergy here is to support the kinds of livestock that farmers and households find viable in less predictable research environments. So you might provide farmers with small livestock investments like chickens, pigs, goats, or turkeys in drought-prone regions, even if it was a traditional cattle region. Farmers explain that large livestock like cattle requires far too much grazing pasture and water to be a reliable source of income as seasons become more variable. And they also explain that pigs, goats, chickens, and turkeys have a shorter birth to slaughter time, which makes it easier to think that you will get to that point of slaughtering them before you're unable to provide pasture and water. So here are pictures of cows that they used to have and now turkeys that you see now. So some broader implications of this work are that bottom-up individual adaptations aggregate to impact food security, especially in the agricultural sector. Also, that climate change adaptation is a social process. I don't have time to speak in depth about this today, but these small farmer practices are very relational. They occur in networks and they're often communal. And thinking about them in that way is important to successful adaptation and food security policy. Lastly, policy and finance can support synergies and local adaptations to scale them up for increased food security based on my research. And then I'll just close by encouraging us to reimagine how to approach food security in light of bottom-up data. I think conceptualizing adaptation as this bottom-up adjustment to climate conditions is key to anticipating food security at the micro scale and different than considering it from a macro perspective. I also think that land tenure policy can be food security policy, and climate mobility policy can also support food security. And lastly, that lessons from small scale and indigenous farmers could be important to large scale agriculture as well, in terms of what is functioning locally at the small scale that could function at the large scale. And then here I have a QR code if you'd like to go to my website, my email address, and my Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brianna Castro. It was very informative about the everyday adaptation, and you had a lot of case studies going on. And since I'm also working on land tenure security, you're saying that land tenure policy is food security. I really agree with your thoughts. Thank you very much. So our next distinguished speaker is Dr. Suji she's a project assistant professor at the Institute for Future Initiatives, the University of Tokyo. So Dr. Suji, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kurushima. So good afternoon, everyone. Nice to meet you here. My name is Su Jie. I'm a project assistant professor at the Institute for Future Initiatives, the University of Tokyo. So today I would like to take you to look at the fastest growing food system in the world, the aquaculture, how climate change is impacting this aquaculture production, and what are the adaptation measures, and what are the barriers that we are facing for the adaptation. So in 2022, there is a paper published in the Nature put an argument that aquaculture will continue to depend more on land than sea. And now we see that in the aquaculture, or say freshwater aquaculture, has become the major contributor of edible aquatic food, particularly in the global south, where around 80% of them are small and medium-scale aquaculture farmers. And the climate change and extremes weathers are increasing the food security in these areas where the small-scale farmers have relatively low buffering capacity and are relatively sensible to the climate-related shocks and the variability. So there are already a lot of news and reports talking about the impacts of the extreme weather events and climate change on the aquaculture, for example, like floods and the droughts, and also extreme storms, salinity intrusion. However, when we see the literature, we see that in the aquaculture compared to marine and the coastal aquaculture are largely understudied. So there are also a word saying that in the aquaculture is the silent majority. And there are three main gaps that remain for the inner aquaculture, including a systematic understanding of impacts, the corresponding adaptation measures, and the barriers to adaptation. And understanding this pathway of these impacts and the corresponding adaptation is the first step that we can use to use this knowledge to predict the possible devastating effects and to adopt well-informed strategies for adaptation. So here we conduct a systematic review followed by qualitative content analysis. We identify 80 studies that fall within this topic, climate change and aquaculture. And we find that Firstly, the global distribution, or say geographical distribution of the review papers, kind of reflect the global distribution of aquaculture protection. However, surprisingly, we see relatively small number of papers conducted in China, which is the largest fish producer in the world. Second, we see that there is only a quarter of papers that conducting household level studies, and only one study that assessed the impacts quantitatively, which shows the huge research gap that we need to engage more with the local communities to understand the impacts and how the adaptation on the ground. So to better understand how climate change will affect aquaculture and to the food security, as Dr. Nazia said, we need to understand the whole value chain, not only the production, but also the transportation, the marketing. So here we summarize and generalize the aquaculture value chain into input, supply, production, logistic, and marketing, and then finally to the consumer. And further, we divide it into two big segments: the off-farm segment, which is include input, supply, logistic, and marketing, and then the on-farm segment, which is production. So here we use the alluvial diagram to show the pathway from the climate change and the extreme weathers, and then the impacts, and then what adaptation barriers that they are using, or they reported, or they proposed to address these issues. I will not go very details to each the pathways, but just show you an example here. For example, the cold extremes on the hatcheries that will affect the fish feeding rates, that will further affect the spawning rate. And what we can do is we can use the heater to address this issue. So this figure shows generally the impact adaptation pathways on the off-farm aquaculture value chain: seed supply, feed supply, and the post-harvesting. Now, what we can see here is the absence of the evidence in the segment of feed supply and the impacts on post-harvesting and marketing. This also shows a big research gap on the aquaculture value chain. However, when we look at the on-farm aquaculture, we see that there are already a lot of studies and evidence on the impacts and adaptation. So here I extract firstly the impacts and adaptation on the water environment, because water is the primary source for aquaculture farming. And for example, here shows a pathway that the temperature will increase the fish pond, then will increase the water temperature, and then the dissolved oxygen decrease. And what we can do is we can use the aerator or water circulation to enhance the water exchange. The other very direct impacts on the on-farm aquaculture is on the aquaculture assets, which is the infrastructure. So extreme weather events like floods and extreme storms or heavy rainfall, they will just damage the pond dike, and the fish will just escape from the pond. So what we can do is we need to reinforce the pond dike to make sure that the construction of the pond are strong enough to protect the pond from the flood. So above we show the pathways, and further we divided the adaptation measures into 7 classes based on the time consumption, the cost, the benefit, the form, and the scale. And then we further link them to the barriers. So we also classified the barriers into 5 sections: governance and institutional barriers, technological and informational barriers, economic and financial barriers, environmental barriers, and the social and cultural barriers. So what we do is, through literature review, we identify what linkages that they are reporting about the barriers to the specific adaptation measures. And what we found in this whole picture is there are several key messages. First, what are the major barriers they are facing is the governance and the institutional barriers. The second is the technological information barriers, and the third is the economic and financial barriers. Also, we can see that the adaptation with higher cost that encounters more barriers, and the adaptation with larger scales that also faces more barriers. So here we develop, based on the previous findings, develop a conceptual framework of adaptation in aquaculture to climate change. We show this pathway from climate change to an extreme to in the impacts to adaptation. And this understanding and the straightforward visualized pathway can further be decided in the local context as materials for training or extension education in future interventions to improve farmers' knowledge and capacity. And also, this study provides an inventory of adaptation solutions that could be used to address the relevant impacts. Furthermore, what we show here, the barriers also give us three key messages to foster the environment for inland aquaculture for adaptation. The first is we need to incorporate climate change in the full agenda, international, national, and the local policies, which is specific targets at the biggest barrier of governance and institutional barriers. The second is we need to develop information sharing platforms to enhance access to timely information. This is designed to target at the informational and the technological barriers. And the third is we need to increase financial investments for sustainable, climate resilient, equity food system transformation. There is just less than 30% of countries depend on aquaculture, aquatic food production, have sought adaptation finance. And further, through the literature review, we also see future directions for the research. The first is we need to assess the magnitude of impacts and the effectiveness of adaptation solutions. More community engagements that should be needed to understand better the impacts and adaptation on the ground. Second is we need more studies that conduct on other value chain segments, which requires multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary research to unpack the whole impact and adaptation pathways in the whole aquaculture value chain. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suji. It was informative to hear about the aquaculture for adaptation and the impact on the aquatic food production, to learn about the food security on the aquaculture. So our last speaker is Professor Alexandros Gasparatos. And Professor Alexandros is a professor of sustainability science at the Institute for Future Initiatives, the University of Tokyo. Okay, so Professor Alexandros, please take the floor.
Good afternoon, everybody, to the audience and the colleagues here. Thank you very much for the invitation for this event. And I'm going to be talking about how to unpack climate and food security trade-offs in commodity crop value chains in sub-Saharan Africa. The colleagues so far have discussed some of the intersections between climate change and food security. Climate change, we all know, it's a major direct driver of ecosystem change. Okay, and this change has often negative effects on food security through the multiple context-specific mechanisms and pathways, such as the ones outlined by previous colleagues. However, climate change can be loosely an indirect driver of ecosystem change. It creates preconditions to develop land-based mitigation and adaptation strategies, whether we're talking about nature-based solutions or renewable energy projects. And such strategies can create very multidimensional trade-offs between climate change and food security. So I will come with from a little bit different angle than the previous colleagues earlier. I'm going to be talking for a very specific type of let's say, land-based mitigation strategy, bioenergy value chains, and especially biofuel projects that created liquid fuel from biomass through different chemical processes for transport to add or completely substitute conventional transport fuel. These types of projects were promoted very heavily in sub-Saharan Africa in the period between 2005 to 2015. These projects that I'm going to be talking now, we finished them around 6 or 7 years, but I think it's a very exemplary example of how it is possible for something that you think is going to mitigate climate change to create all sorts of trade-offs at the local level and how we can unpack them. And I'm going to be talking for two very specific types of biofuel, sugarcane ethanol and Jatropha biodiesel. And we work in local projects in Swaziland, Mozambique, and Malawi. If you hear these projects, of course, they are land-based. So you think immediately that the moment they convert land, you are reducing food security. Less land is allocated for food production. However, this is only one of the mechanisms that might affect food security. There are all sorts of other mechanisms that can provide positive or negative effects for food security. For example, people can gain money and they can buy food, or people can get better access. Producers that they have a stable market can get better access to buy fertilizer to increase their yields. Or you might have all sorts of other effects. So we did a systematic review that we published it in Food Security, and we identified all sorts of different mechanisms that might be affecting food security through the transition, through this kind of projects. A very interesting one is, obviously, these projects are taking place in totally different socio-ecological systems. We're talking about agricultural projects that might end taking place into very dense agricultural landscape, far right-hand corner column, or low-density agricultural areas, left-hand corner. And you can create them into very big plantations or by smallholders. All of them, even though they are supposed to be the same type of mitigation mechanism, have radically different trade-offs because they are implemented very, very differently at the local level. And they are major drivers of land use change. You can see on the left columns how the landscapes might look before the conversion to these big biofuel projects and how it looks afterwards. The deep purple there shows the biofuel projects. And we're talking about large change of land, large transformation of land, that sometimes it can be agricultural land, but sometimes it can be high density forest or low density forest that is being used by local communities, again, to take care about some of their food needs. So this is to say that, yes, we have a land-based mitigation mechanism, and of course, we're expecting that it's going to be driving land use change. This can have important ramifications, for example, on all sorts of impacts, sustainability impacts. We did an analysis about carbon storage change, and we see over 20 years life cycles that certain types of sugarcane plantations might have a positive effect on carbon storage, while some sort of other biofuel projects might have negative effects on carbon storage. So you can see immediately, even though they might have been promoted for climate change mitigation, they might have adverse effects. What we found much more important is that it can have very different effects also on food security. And it can have different effects on the community. For example, we went and we did 1,000 household surveys with plantation workers, smallholders that were growing sugarcane or jatropha, some of them irrigated, some of them non-irrigated, and control groups, community members living around the plantations or very far away. And what we find in this very messy figure is that we see very different food security outcomes across different measures of food security. Left-hand column is food consumption score. It's a measure of dietary diversity. Middle column is household food insecurity access scale. It is a measure of hunger. And right-hand corner is coping strategy index, a measure of coping. coping in periods of hunger. And what we find is that, yes, indeed, those that are engaged in biofuel projects have a little bit better food security, not always, depends on the area, depends on the engagement. Same applies when we are looking at their poverty level. Sorry, it's not very visible somehow in this figure. What we are finding is that those that are working in plantations usually tend to have much better, much lower poverty, multidimensional poverty. We used something called the multidimensional poverty index. However, other kind of smallholders that are growing sugarcane or jatropha might be having higher levels of poverty. What do I want to say with all of this? I throw you a lot of figures, okay, to say that it's not only the fact that climate change can directly affect food systems. Climate change creates the preconditions to create land-based mitigation mechanisms that have all sorts of trade-offs on the ground. We are talking about land use modification, okay, that might be affecting natural land, it might be affecting agricultural areas, that can be translated to carbon storage differentials. It can manifest into differentiated food security outcomes for different community members. People that work in the plantations might be a little bit better off, but not always. People that are growing sugarcane or jatropha might be a little bit better off than their community, but not always. And we find all sorts of different levels between the food security outcomes and the poverty outcomes between those that are being involved. This is to say that, again, all sorts of trade-offs emerge. Okay, these trade-offs can be very diverse and depend between locations, production models, and technologies. And this is what Professor Hussein told at the beginning. If you look at the case study, you're going to get a lot of the internal variability. You're going to see a lot of the specific conditions that might be affecting the performance of these projects and the trade-offs locally. However, when we were looking at them a little bit deeper, of course, local climate will affect some of these trade-offs. Local socio-ecological systems might affect it. Local cultural system will affect it. But when we were looking much deeper, what was consistently coming from every case study that we work, it was that many of these trade-offs were mediated by institutional factors, institutions that were put in place without necessarily considering these types of projects. Land governance. So a lot of these areas that we are working, you have very unique and very specific land access and tenure mechanisms that were not prepared to accept all these internal and external investments coming in, big companies buying land. You might have heard a lot of the discussions about, let's say, land grabbing, but this went both ways. It is, of course, problems of the big companies, but the local land tenure systems and land governance systems have not been created, at least in the areas that we have been working, to accommodate this type of investments. In order to create this kind of big plantations, you need to consolidate hundreds or thousands of small lands, but without necessarily having land compensation mechanisms in place. So some people might be winning, some people might be losing. Payment structures. Are people being paid once per year or multiple times a year? What happens if you paid every month? People that were paid every month, plantation workers, had better food security performance because they could buy food. Those that were being paid only once per year, they were having, like the sugarcane producers, were having much higher salaries, but they were not having enough money to buy food in periods of food insecurity. Markets. What are the incentives and the regulatory structures to regulate this type of investments? Market maturity and sustainability. A lot of these projects were acquired. Land, thousands or millions of hectares around Africa were given to these types of projects, and a lot of them were collapsed in the end because they were not mature markets. So there were very predatory or very speculative investments that eventually did not materialize in the benefits that were expected. So what I find very interesting, and this is about biofuels. Okay, biofuels might be dead in Africa right now, but there is all sorts of huge discussions about millions of hectares that are being bought to be allocated for carbon sequestration projects. They're going to go again the same market mechanisms and again the same tenure mechanisms to create winners and losers without necessarily having this kind of trade-offs in mind. With that, sorry, I went very fast to everything to show that all sorts of trade-offs might be emerging from this type of projects, and we need really interdisciplinary research to be able to capture all these trade-offs that are coming forward. Thank you very much. You can find all these publications at my website. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Alexandros, and thank you very much for pointing out about the trade-offs of climate change and also for the food security and the needs for the interdisciplinary approach. So we had the presentations by our speakers, so I would like to move on to the panel discussions. So in the presentation, the speakers covered a diverse range of topics, and we were able to learn that the food security is cross-cutting and that it requires an interdisciplinary approach. So for instance, we talked about land, individual approaches, sustainability, agriculture, and so a lot of other topics. So I also want to point out that because the food system has many phases, and as the European Commission's concept of farm to fork suggests that it is necessary to look at food from its production to point where it reaches the dinner table as a food system. So therefore, it is necessary to consider the competing notion of food security, such as security for food. So these were the topics that were raised in this session. So I would like to start from this question for the panel. What may be some entry points regarding interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary scholarship? So this is the first questions, and I would like to ask all the speakers. So maybe I could start from Brianna. Oh, okay, yeah.
Sure. Thank you for your question. I talked a bit about this in my presentation because I feel quite strongly that an important entry point for interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary research on food security is combining research from the bottom-up perspective that is in communities and participatory and inductive in approach with research on the policy side that is looking for synergies. And that's why I emphasize that in my presentation. I think that it's difficult to do both, and I'm not advocating for only case studies, but I do think, similar to what Professor Gasparato said, that when we look at many case studies in many different places, as I also do in my work, we begin to see where similarities emerge in very localized contexts with local cultures and institutions, and where policy levers might be when we put that policy research and that bottom-up research together. So I think that that's a good start, rather than beginning from the frameworks or approaches, to begin from the data on both sides.
Okay, thank you very much. So I would like to ask Dr. Suji on the same question. What may be some entry points regarding interdisciplinary scholarship?
Thank you very much for your question. So actually, when doing the review, I already feel strongly about the multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. For example, if we look at the impacts, we need to understand science about fish biology, and then if you look at the adaptation, we need to understand some social science, all of this together. So when I'm doing this, I already feel that all this multidisciplinary happened in one study. And the other thing I would like to talk about is also a research gap that I found in the review is there is still lack of community engagement, which I like your Dr. Brianna's presentation very much is about engagement with the community. What we find not only from literature, but I also talk to other aspects on the countries like Africa and Southeast Asia and the Pacific. I find it's very interesting that different communities, they are dealing the impacts of climate change in very different way. Even some fish farmers, they are not like large scale communities doing the aquaculture, but they have this kind of traditional knowledge that they can integrate them into their adaptation. However, in some countries, they are just lack of this capacity and the knowledge to understand what is really happen within my fish pond. So yeah, that's the 2 points I want to mention. The first is the research and the second is the community engagement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suji. And I would like to pass this same question to Dr. Alexandros.
So thank you very much. The project that I presented now, it brought together 15 researchers. So we were quite a big team. We were ecologists, economists, energy scientists, policy scientists from 4 countries. So it's a very big project. What we find particularly useful when we're doing this project, because from the beginning we understood it's such a multidimensional problem when we are talking about what are the impacts of biofuels on food security. Food security is a multidimensional concept. We knew that there were a lot of mechanisms that were affecting food security. We realized from the beginning that we need all sorts of disciplines. So this is very easy from the beginning of the project. What was much more difficult for us was how to synthesize the findings. Because as I said, there were 10 of us, 15 of us. It was not just me. So what we found particularly useful in this process is to frame the project from the beginning as trade-offs and synergies. What you win and what you lose, who are the winners, who are the losers in the broader sense. The environment might be a winner or might be a loser, local communities, companies, wider society. So from the beginning, we make a very conscious choice to frame it across trade-offs and synergies, okay? And to understand why are they promoted? What are the policy drivers behind? Okay, so even though it was not part of the project necessarily to do a policy analysis, we did a policy analysis from the beginning because we wanted to understand what are the different interests that are pushing these projects and who is being affected. Okay, the moment that we framed the project like that, it was straightforward that we identified that the local community might win or might lose depending on certain conditions. The environment might win or lose depending on whatever situations. And that on its own almost dictated the methodologies we will be using. So we did not try from the beginning to, let's say, okay, let's bring everybody together and have an interdisciplinary project. It was like, okay, let's try to unravel it. Let's try to break it down to its basic component. Why do we promote these projects? Okay, who wins, who loses, and maybe through which mechanisms. The moment that we solve that in our mind, it was done almost immediately that, okay, we need a carbon storage research that the ecologists in the team are going to be doing because we need to do ecological surveys. But at the same time, we have to do a life cycle analysis because we have to see the energy balance. So the energy researchers in our team did that. So that helped us very much. And I have worked quite on a few interdisciplinary projects over the years. It requires a very good meeting at the beginning of the project between the research team to just abstract the project, okay, understand the underlying mechanisms. And I think this is a very good entry point. And the moment that you do that, I'm almost sure it's very clear what kind of disciplines you need and what kind of methodologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was interesting that you used the word winner and loser for your project. And how do you determine this winner and loser? Please, this is apart from the question, but yeah, I was just curious about how you analyze this winner losers.
Well, it depends on the impact. winners in some impacts might be losers in others. So it's obvious to see which member in the community the income is increasing, or which members in the community the food security is decreasing, or which part of the community is losing access to communal forest that is being translated to a plantation. So usually the way that we try to do it is by impact. We do not have what is the winner of this project or the losers of this project. We always do it by impact. And we find always that in some cases, some people win and some people lose. Okay, it's very rare to have only winners, win-win situation, or only losers. And it's very rare to, in my experience with these projects, to have, how shall I put it, people that lose in every dimension or win in every dimension. And I'm going to give you some examples. So plantation workers are having very low multidimensional poverty because they have a little bit better housing, access to education for their kids. They have a little bit better income, which is stable, that is coming every month, but is not very high level compared to the smallholders. So even though they can buy food every month, okay, sometimes towards the end of the month, they do not have enough food, while the smallholders might get a very big block of cash. And when it is highly food insecure period, they cannot buy food. So we try to create these storylines to identify the different dimensions that people are winning and losing. Because I don't think you can have only winners, only losers, winners in every dimension. So this is why we do it always, trade-off synergies. I do not know if I answered your question.
Thank you very much for your answer. Okay. If you would like to jump in by hearing others' answers, please do so. But I would like to move on to the second questions. So the second question is that you explained about the entry point for the interdisciplinary scholarship, but what are the challenges of adopting such an approach, and what can be done to overcome these challenges? So maybe I can start again from Dr. Castro, or should I? Okay, so, okay. So next, okay, I would okay. So I would ask Dr. Alexandros again. But yeah.
Well, there are challenges at every level. Okay, so I will try to reflect a little bit in different directions. For example, there is challenge to do interdisciplinary project as a team. Okay, how an ecologist and an economist, sociologist and an engineer come together, sit down and work together. So there is this kind of challenges. It is how you synthesize this in order to create a cohesive outcome and communicate it to decision makers. And how do you deal with the different levels of uncertainties that each discipline deals with? Okay, so all of this is challenges that we have dealt with. Okay, how we do it as a team. We have tried all sorts of ways, from shouting to each other to sitting down and getting a little bit more, how shall I put it, a structured approach. One way that we found extremely useful is to sit down and do workshops within our team and develop causal loop diagrams. And we are creating, saying, okay, what if you take this plot of land and you make a big plantation? Okay, what is going to be affecting? So we create causal loop diagrams to make sure that we, as a team, are on the same page and we run them with practitioners, whether they're working for government agencies or companies or civil society or whatever. Usually this process enables us as a team to be on the same page, to be able to sit down as a team and do an interdisciplinary project because we are on the same page now. Yes, okay, we are doing something with energy modeling and something with sociology and something with ecology, but we are on the same page. We understand which part of the system everything comes together. The way that we try to communicate it is, then there is the difficulty of communication. We have to be always very, very mindful. What is our target group? In our case, we make very conscious choice that we do not target directly the local community because it is very difficult. Not that it's not important, but we are not the right persons to do it. the uncertainties and the analysis that we are doing is very difficult to be miscommunicated. Okay. For example, you cannot go to a local community and say sugarcane is good for you. Okay, sugarcane is good for some aspects, some other aspects. If everybody starts doing sugarcane at one point, they might drive the prices down, they might create all these kind of problems. Okay, so we have to be very mindful of our audience, and we make very clear the way that we're communicating the uncertainties, because whatever we are doing as scientists, it has very deep uncertainties. And we are not going to be the ones experiencing the consequences of our suggestions, policy suggestions. So these are very big challenges that we have found along the way. And of course, it depends on the context. For example, if we are working in, let's say, in Japan, maybe we'll take a little bit different approach than when we are working in Africa. But these are the usual challenges that we deal with. How do we sit down as a team together? How do we communicate effectively? And how do we deal with our uncertainties in all this process? So that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I would like to ask Dr. Suji next.
One challenges I can think of is like how we can really evaluate the interdisciplinary research or projects that we are doing. Because if we now we are talking about ensuring food security under climate crisis, and are we only looking at the objectives of food security? Are we not looking at other objectives like economic sustainability and environmental sustainability? So this is quite important to evaluate the impact of what we are doing in this work. And the solution that I can think of is we really need a holistic evaluation framework that looking at the 3 pillars of sustainable development. We need to ensure environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, and the social sustainability with the engagement of local community, of course, and always, but also ensure like what really we do that can impact that local community in a more holistic, sustainable way. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Castro, the same question.
Sure. I'll add to that question. I think my colleagues have spoken really well to some of the practical challenges of this work and the goals to keep in mind, which I really appreciate. I think there are some other practical challenges like, does your multidisciplinary team understand terms in the same way if you define them in the same way? Coming to an agreement on what perspective you might take if you're going to take a theoretical perspective approach to your work can be much more difficult on a combined social, environmental science and policy team. And also, I think the work just takes longer. I think you have to slow down and be intentional. And that can be a challenge sometimes, especially on grant timelines and when we know that the problem is so urgent. But I also think there are some challenges in multidisciplinary work in terms of production of knowledge. I find that it can be more challenging to publish in academic journals, which we know we want to publish our academic knowledge and we want to produce policy relevant reports as well. I think that finding the right academic outlet and framing things in a specific way as a multidisciplinary team can be a little bit more challenging and requires some forethought. Some things that help with that are targeting in advance how you'll frame for your academic audience this work. But I think that it really lends itself to policy relevant reports and policy impact. So that's a place where you can push and potentially move more quickly. We've focused a lot on our different disciplines in talking about interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity, but I also think that it can be very productive to co-produce knowledge and do participatory research with practitioners. And I think that comes with different challenges to consider as well, particularly about the pace of research and publishing for practitioners. And so I think having intermediate goals, we might produce a report more quickly that is relevant to practitioners or communities and their outcome goals. And then the data piece, the science piece might come later on that longer timeline so you can keep the ball rolling. These are just a few thoughts I have on those two separate ways of being broad in our approach to the work.
Thank you for this useful insights. And since IGC is working on also for policy research, making different production output for like policy and academic, and the different pace is I think it's also very important. So thank you for pointing this out. So let me move on to the final question that I have prepared. So the question is, what implication does the approach have on the climate crisis? So we have been discussing about the interdisciplinary approaches and also like bottom-up approaches, resilience approaches, and different kind of approaches. And we have also had the presenters to introduce about their case studies and the approaches that they have been taking. So since we're working on this climate security project, I would like to hear about what kind of implication this approach can have on the climate crisis. So next, I will also start from the, okay, okay. So Dr. Suji, okay.
Thank you for your question. So about like implications, here I just want to follow up what the challenges that we have when we doing the disciplinary, because challenges are also kind of opportunity or implications for the research. So again, like the interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary means that different disciplinary that scientists coming together, coming up a common research topic or research projects. And here, that's our opportunity to develop this kind of holistic thinking of when we have like economics, when we have like social scientists, when we have environmental scientists, when we have like food scientists, all these scientists that can contribute to this holistic thinking of how we can grow up these systematic and holistic solutions for the climate crisis. And this also needs the integration of the local communities' knowledge. And once we build up, like we gather together all the stakeholders' ideas, their perspective, then it's better to come up with the evidence, scientific-based evidence to inform policy making. And finally, don't forget to capacity building for the local communities, because it's also very important to that they understand that not only food is important, but also their livelihood, but also the environment, and understand that the climate is changing, because the knowledge of the climate change from what I see in the aquaculture from the farmer's perspective, they actually know quite little about it. So this is also very important that all of these disciplinary scientists coming together and to build up the capacity of the local communities. Thank you.
Very much. Yes, so okay, Dr. Alexandros, could you answer the questions?
Yes. So I struggle a little bit with this question. So I'm not really sure. I will give it a try. Okay. Climate change is a very multidimensional topic. Food security is another one. Poverty is another one. Sustainability is another one. So it is very, very clear that we need interdisciplinary approaches. Like the scale of the problem requires interdisciplinary approaches. My biggest worry has been the integration of knowledge. Okay, so it's very easy I do not know if it is the right word, but you can definitely create interdisciplinary knowledge. How do you bring it together, and how do you convey it in a way for actionable research? Okay, and I'm going to give you some examples from our research. We always struggle because people, like when we're presenting this work, whether it is academics or decision makers, pick the type of information they like. If they see a positive effect that is good for their agenda, they will focus on the positive effect. If they see a negative effect, they're going to focus on the negative effect. So this is something that we're struggling very much. And I do not know if there is a good or a bad, maybe it is closer to a challenge, maybe it is closer to the previous question, what I'm saying right now. But I do not know how to put it, but this knowledge integration in a way that it creates a message that is actionable by a decision maker that might have their own personal agendas or institutional agendas can be very tricky. So this is something that we're struggling very much over the years. When I started this work, when we started this work on biofuels, okay, there was the very big discussion, is biofuel good or bad? And there were one part that was saying it's the worst thing in the world, it is bad for food security. And the other part was very positive, saying this is such a huge business opportunity that will enable us to modernize agricultural systems in Africa. And you had these two totally different viewpoints colliding. When we did the findings of our research, we found exactly this. You can modernize, but it's going to be good, bad for the food security of some people. Okay. Still, when we were having it at the end, these results, people were selectively choosing it. So this is, I think, a very big problem of interdisciplinary approach for climate crisis. It has the huge potential to create knowledge that is needed. It is the approach forward, okay? But it can be picked selectively by those that might decide to make a decision. And I really do not know how to navigate this trade-off. It is essential, difficult to communicate. To publish, Dr. Castro earlier said about publications. I don't think it is so difficult personally to publish interdisciplinary research. There are a lot of venues that, and it's relatively easy to actually make it something actionable, like what IGES is trying to do. This is really difficult, and this is something that I'm struggling a lot. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And lastly, Dr. Castro. Yes, thank you.
Great. Yeah, like Dr. Gasparatos, I struggle with this question a little bit because climate crisis is so big. But it made me think about what implications does crisis framing and crisis thinking have on our research and our work? What does it mean when we approach the data that we collect and the communities that we engage with from a mindset of crisis? And I think one of the things that it means is that we think short term rather than long term often. And we're not thinking across scale in our outcomes and our policy recommendations sometimes. And so I think questioning whether we're in a sprint or a marathon, and we're in a marathon with climate change and climate crisis, can help us have more actionable impact with the products that we produce. I also think that we have the opportunity to nuance policy conversations with our research and our multidisciplinary work, if we're intentional about that and take the time to do so. And these policy conversations need to be nuanced in terms of what's happening at the hyper-local scale in order to have, if you're proposing adaptation or you're proposing resilience or food security policies, in order to have high levels of uptake and success. And the last thing that comes to mind for me is that we need a really, and this relates to what was just being said, awareness of politics across scales and how to speak to those politics, both when it comes to policymakers at the international level and also local level and even inter-household politics at the very local level, in order for our work to have impacts. And being aware of those politics will help us find opportunities for synergies and understand trade-offs more effectively, I think. So I think those approaches could help us attend more to climate change impacts over time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this insightful discussions. And since food security is an ongoing issue and we have different kind of issues all over the world, we hope we could continue our research on this in the future. So lastly, I would like to invite Dr. Nazia Hussain again for the comments on this, the feedback that the answers that we got from the panelists.
Wow, thank you. Following everyone is tough. I think all the points that have been made by Dr. Castro, Dr. Jisoo, Dr. Gasparatos are thoughtful. Picking up from Dr. Castro, 2 points about the politics at different scales. And secondly, about the difficulties in reconciling different theoretical conversations and such. From Dr. Gasparatos, the practical obstacles in doing such research, and Dr. Jisoo, who mentions about, I thought one thing that I really liked was you talked about capacity development, not just community engagement. I think my takeaway would be that such conversations are important. This kind of research is not easy, but very simply, in terms of your last question, what implications does such an approach have? I think it's necessary. We need all hands on deck. The crisis or the problem or the reality of climate change is it's multifaceted. It's a wicked problem. And so we need to combine different kinds of information and different kinds of lenses to unpack what is happening and what we can do. So, yeah.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. So since we couldn't have the keynote speech at the beginning, we still have a little time left. And I heard like there's one few questions from the floor in this room. So maybe we could ask these questions.
Yeah, I think today for the technical reason we cannot collect a question from the Zoom, but I think it's all right to ask questions from the floor. So yeah, thank you so much for the really rich panel and the presentations. I learned a lot. I have a question to Alex, and after that I have a question to Brianna. So Alex, thanks so much. I learned a lot about your research project and trade-offs and their synergies. Two, I think, basic questions to understand your line of argument. One is that in our project as well, when thinking about climate change and food security nexus, we differentiate the physical impact of climate change, that how it affects to food security, and also we talk about how climate change mitigation and adaptation policies, and maybe loss and damage as well, might affect to the food security. So we differentiate or categorize these two elements. Is it, and I think that is similar to how you talk about direct and indirect effect of climate change. So do you see any differences between these two approaches, or what do you think it's identical more or less? So that's one first question. And second one would be in the last part, you talked about how institutional factors mediate trade-offs and synergies, and you raise land governance, payment structure, and market. And maybe I just lost what you explained because you went a bit fast. So are these three elements are just examples that you raised, or these are the kind of three elements you identified as the key institutional factors from your research? So I'd like to understand a bit more about these three elements. The question to Brianna, thank you so much. Really like the idea about everyday adaptation. And my question could be a bit like a scholastic rather than more practical, but are there any normative dimensions to your concept, or do you try to argue something normative through this concept? Because in a policy sphere, we more and more see the ideas such as locally led adaptation try to push forward, make a decision-making power to the more local side to say that adaptation should be more bottom-up rather than a top-down approach. So do you carry any normative ideas or normative arguments with this concept of everyday adaptation? And the second question, it's a bit difficult to ask, but I try to understand your approach, and it's kind of like simple and could be naive question, but how do you differentiate between everyday adaptation and everyday kind of ordinary practice of farmers? So they anyway respond to or cope with their situation on an everyday basis. So how do you delineate these are the everyday adaptation and these are the kind of everyday life for the farmers? So that's a kind of like method question, right? Thanks so much. Maybe Alex can say.
So let me start with the second one on the institutional aspects. In the beginning, so at the end of the project, we're trying to find out all sorts of common threads between the case studies. And we will have ended up with some results that they say, yeah, some things are good, some things are bad. It's depending on the area and the crop and stuff like that. Okay. Which is the classic problem that you usually have when you are doing individual case studies. How do you bring them together? We realized that actually what was very common in all case studies was that a lot of the trade-offs were mediated by institutional factors. Yes, the crop might have affected, the local climate might have been affecting, like the local, let's say, landscape might have been mediating some of the trade-offs, but in reality, and something that you can have actionable, you can have actions, is the institutional component. And that was particularly interesting because a lot of the times when you're doing this type of research, at least the one that we were doing, you do it through a social ecological system lens. So a lot of the institutional factors tend to be a little bit background. You don't understand them very well. Okay, you know that they are there, but if you do not try to understand their impact, you do not you do not understand how a lot of the things come into perspective. So what we identified is that these three aspects, markets, land tenure, and payment structures, were by far the most important that were affecting a lot of the trade-offs that we're seeing. Because how is it possible to have sugarcane in Malawi and Swaziland, same crop, two different localities, but similar climate, okay? And at the same time, at the one place, the workers to be so well off, and in the other area, the workers to be so bad off, worse off. So there are so many things that you can identify, but in this case, it was very obvious that, yes, we have this crop that can be a solution, but it is how it is being implemented, the institutional aspects that are affecting a lot of the trade-offs. And we realize that they are so important, especially for these types of projects, that need to be considered like properly. So this is what we try to do, because you might have the right, let's say, development option implemented wrongly. And that's about it. You might have a very good crop in a very good area, but a very horrible implementation process. What are you going to do in this case? You lose maybe the potential that the crop has to offer. So this is why we delved at the end to the institutional issues. And the first question about climate and food, I did not understand it very well, to tell you the truth. I just gave it this example here that I wanted to differentiate a little bit my presentation from the other participants, that while they are looking at the impacts of climate change on food security, I'm looking of how climate change might create preconditions for novel production systems that is going to create trade-offs, food security trade-offs. So I just wanted to differentiate it. But in my opinion, a lot of these trade-offs that I identified are very similar in when you're talking about nature-based solutions that are being implemented in large scale in different parts of the world. A lot of these are going to come in place. Some people are going to be affected positively. Some people are going to be affected negatively. Some benefits are going to materialize and others not. And at the bottom is going to be some sort of institutional factors highly likely affecting. So that was, what I wanted to convey with my presentation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for your great questions. And your second question was what I wrestled with reviewers. So maybe it was you, no, for a paper. But how to differentiate between everyday adaptations for climate change and how people are adapting or living their normal lives is a critical question, because climate change is now a part of normal life. And there's so much uncertainty and difficulty in putting our finger on what is climate change, that I have to think carefully about that when I'm looking at daily behavior. And so a couple of measures that I use is, one is it management of a new stressor or a change stressor that has come with climate change impacts in the region? And has this change in a person's routines, has the timing of it aligned with the changes in climate conditions in the place where they are. The ones I mentioned and many others, that's definitely the case. Often in interviews, people won't even, or in surveys, bring up these actions as a response to climate change or some of the things that they're managing as caused by climate change. But that's our job on the research side, is to see these alignments and to see people responding to more flooding, hotter temperatures, shifting seasons through new behaviors that they themselves might not even associate with climate, similar to what she was mentioning earlier. So that's one, and just aligning it with the timeline. And another thing to consider is that often these actions are resilience strategies that farmers specifically may have had for typical dry seasons, for example. And often the first adaptations that I see made in individual behavior are strategies or tactics that people have had that have been successful in the past. But something that I see in the over 5-6 years I followed for specific farming communities, for example, is that those are the first that stop working. They fail. Strategies that we've had for a long time in everyday life, especially with farming, no longer work in changing climate environments. And so that's where new strategies emerge. So yes, sometimes they are the same practices. They're being used more often at a higher frequency or for a longer duration in new climate conditions, but also those fail first and new ones emerge. Your other question was about normative arguments. I don't make normative arguments about how individuals should adapt. I would say my normative arguments are towards us as researchers and policymakers, and they are that if we're not attuned, if we're prescribing what we consider climate conditions to be in a place and how and what list of options of response are available to communities and individuals and farmers, then I think we're missing quite a bit. And so we need to open up what we consider count and incorporate into our policy to avoid maladaptation and low uptake of new policy. So my normative argument is for us more than for communities.
Okay, thank you for the answers. Are there any other questions from the floor? If not, I think we could end early and so conclude the first session here. So thank you very much for joining us. And from now on, it will be a break, but the Zoom will be kept open during the break. So we will resume our second session at 3:30 Japan time. So we hope you could continue to join us online as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, welcome back for the online guests, and thank you for coming back for the physical guests as well after the short coffee break. I'll be moderating the session 2. My name is Naoyuki Okano from the Adaptation and Water Area at IGS, Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, Hayama, Japan. So for session 2, after hearing the rich discussion in the session 1 about more scientific analysis of the climate change and food security nexus, we're looking more into the policy aspects. The title of the session 2 is Legal Governance and Policy Measures Toward Climate Resilient Food System. We try to look into how the legal governance and policy measures can help achieving the climate resilient food system. And as in the first session, Professor Alexandros or Alex helpfully underlined the importance of institutions in mediating the trade-offs and synergies And I really look deeper into these aspects. And we have 4 panelists to this session. 3 are here and 1 is online. I think I hope that he's online by now. He's in Antwerp and he's here. And I will introduce him later. It's very early in the morning for Tommaso, so thank you for joining us in the early morning. Okay, so I will make a brief framing presentation to introduce the topic. And then after that, there are 4 presentations. So the format is very similar to what we did in the session 1. After we hear 4 presentations, we have a round of panel discussion with the 2 guiding questions that I prepared. And then I will open the floor, I'm sorry, only for the physical participants, but I open the floor for questions or comments. Okay, so I can be very brief. I'll try to figure out. Correct. Okay, so why we have to talk about legal governance policy measures, why it's relevant. I have an environmental law and policy background. And the first question comes to my mind is that, is ensuring food security a legal problem or not? There are a rich debate, and actually we have a lot of discussion about similar to this in the first session. So maybe it looks already a little bit naive question, but still try to show my viewpoint. But there are 2 camps of how to ensure world food security. One camp discusses that technological innovation and agricultural expansion is a key to ensuring world food security in the coming era. On the other hand, some people argue that inadequate and unequal distribution must be addressed. So in this branch, we say that there is plenty of food produced already, but the system to distribute it is a little broken, and that makes difficult for some people to access to adequate food. And here, of course, we can recall the famous work by Professor Amartya Sen. And one quote from him is that law stands between food availability and food entitlement. So this, of course, comes close to the second branch. Okay, so regarding the food systems, there are a lot of debates about governing food systems, and I'll try to discuss some of the elements about how food system governance is unfolding in a Japanese context. But what I'll try to see as a framework is food as a matter of global governance. What I want to say here is that not just national policies can ensure the food security, but these are deeply affected by international legal systems on the one hand, and transnational corporations' activities on the other hand. What I mean by it is that, for example, there is an international trade law and international investment law that supports the cross-border investment for land, for example, for the agricultural production. And one commentator from the first session touched upon the issue of land grabbing, and these are facilitated by such international legal systems. So here, food and maybe the land governance as well should be considered as a part of global governance program. And in order to respond to that, we can't really focus on the national policies exclusively, but also we have to look at international and transnational rulemaking. So I will state here that legal and policy scholars must ask what laws and policies matter in ensuring resilient food systems. Under the current societal shift in response to the rapid societal change caused by the climate crisis, whether the context and conditions change to ensure food security. Can you go to the next slide? my controller doesn't work. Thanks. Okay, so as an example of what kind of policies are out there, I'd like to discuss Japan's approach to food security. So in the beginning, it's really important to differentiate the domestic food security policy on the one hand, and Japan's policy to influence international landscape of food security on the other hand. So one aspect of the policy is domestic food security, and this is basically guided by the Basic Law on Food, Agriculture, and Rural Areas from 1989. And there are some of the provisions that are particularly important here. One is Article 2 and 2, and it says like in consideration of the fact that the world's food supply and demand and trade have some uncertainties, stable food supply to citizens shall be secured by increased domestic agricultural production as a base, together with appropriate combination of import and reserve. As some of you might know, Japan is deeply dependent on the imported food to secure its food security. And here the law claims that we should ensure the domestic agricultural production even more as a basis for food security. And also there are some provisions about food security in emergencies, and especially these provisions are getting more importance when there are more disasters coming by the deepening climate change impacts. Oh, it works now. Okay. Since September 2022, there are ongoing discussions with the government for amending this basic law, and there are key policy documents produced recently. I will just briefly introduce what are the current discussion on the Japanese government going on. And there are two issues that Japan is particularly thinking about. One is to transform food industry into the one in harmony with the environment. So it's not just climate change, but also biodiversity conservation are of course considered as a part of food security policy. And Japan is trying to transform its food system that are more in harmony with the environment. And second is, of course, Japan has a program of this declining population and maintenance and development of production levels and maintenance of local communities is considered as a key problem that Japan should address in the coming years. Okay. And regarding the more related to international aspects and how Japan tries to influence international food security environment, there are 2 points. One is food security as economic security. So these days, security is considered not just as a classic or national security, but there are diverse ways of conceptualizing security. And one is how to ensure security through economic measures. And Japan is getting ahead in making policies and laws in this regard. And 2022 Economic Security Promotion Act was decided. And in there, it states that economic measures related to ensuring national security is important. And as a part of the critical material that Japan needs to ensure its access is a fertilizer that are critical to agricultural production in Japan. So in this way, the food security is now considered as a part of economic security issue. And also, of course, there's an integration of climate-related policies to the food security and climate change impact assessment, as well as the climate change adaptation plan considers food security as a part of it. And especially supply chain resilience and climate change prediction and food policy making are considered as a key policy pillars. And it's also interesting to note that debates on food security are kind of missing in the mitigation policy makings. And here, this is some policy gap. This could be a policy gap in the Japanese policy making in the climate change. So with this, sorry. Okay. All right. So with this, just quick run through of the Japanese policies related to the food security. I'd like to underline some points, and I'd like to introduce our first speaker. One thing we should keep in mind is that climate change is both risk and opportunity for food security. On the one hand, of course, climate change alters the context and conditions under which food security has to be pursued and ensured, and some of the speakers in the first session covered this. However, climate change is an opportunity that society can transform itself, and such transformation can be instrumental in ensuring food security and ensuring the resilient food system. And for that, analysis of the international making processes are key, especially bearing in mind that such food policies and national food policies are embedded as a in a global governance environment. These are the questions for today's discussion that I will introduce in a later panel discussion. But we'd like to think about what are the impacts of climate change on food security governance we should be aware of, and what are the key risks and possibilities out there. And also we'd like to discuss what legal, institutional, or policy approaches are needed to ensure resilient food system under the climate crisis. It's a kind of topic, but this workshop is a part of the 3-year project. And after remaining 2 years activities, we aim to produce policy recommendations based upon our research. So the second question is particularly important to think about what are the institutional, legal, and policy aspects that we can think about our interventions as output of this research project. So with that, I conclude my framing presentation, and I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Yasuo Takahashi, research manager in IGS, biodiversity and forest area. So Yasuo-san, floor is yours.
Thank you, Naoyuki, for kind introduction. And my name is Yasuo Takahashi from the Biodiversity and Forest area in IGS. And Naoyuki kindly invited me to attend this very exciting panel from the viewpoint of possibly biodiversity. My background is on mainly on the ecosystem services studies. And quite recently, we have been working on a focus on the food value chain studies, which focuses on deforestation-related commodities like coffee, cacao, and palm oil, which is imported from other countries. In the first session, they have been discussing about the multidisciplinary approach and difficulties in connecting different disciplines to make actionable recommendations. And I would like to add another complexity to this discussion from the viewpoint of nature, because we have been discussing on the interaction between the food security and climate, but we also need to consider other element in these interactions, which is nature. As Naoyuki kindly explained, in the Japanese food policy, they have highlight on the food industry in harmony with the environment, which should include the nature. So I would like to share some insights from our study in coffee supply chain in Vietnam, as I'm going to present from now. So relating to the first question on the impacts of the climate change on the food security governance. And there's really strong facts that the future climate change will really strongly impact the coffee production worldwide like this. Under the RCP 60.0 scenario, the coffee production worldwide will be halved like this. In the coffee, they have two different varieties. One is coffee Arabica, the other is coffee Canephora, which is called Robusta coffee. And the climate change will impact coffee Arabica more strongly than coffee Robusta. And overall impact is, like, as I said, 50% reduction in the production. So from the viewpoint of coffee producers in Vietnam, these are major challenges in the coffee production in Vietnam from the environmental, social, and economic point of view. Relating to the environmental point of view, the challenges in water depletion, pollution, soil erosion, degradation, and sorry, I can't read that. Forest biodiversity loss and degradation, and climate change, which is mainly due to the GHG emission from the coffee production. In the social domain, they have some challenges in poverty and inequality, and labor shortage and child labor. And also they have economic challenges in coffee production. And there are some background causes for these challenges, which for the environment, there are some unoptimal coffee production systems in Vietnam, which is basically due to the low capacity of the farmers, which include the irrigation water overuse, the overuse of agrochemicals, and changing precipitation patterns, which comes from the climate change, and the forest conversion, which is not really prominent now, but it was about 20 years ago. And also, there are some issues on the fertilizer overuse. And for the social aspect, there are some background causes like the ethnic minorities in the coffee production areas in Vietnam. And also, the labor shortage comes from the low income for the coffee production. This is related to really rapid economic growth in Vietnam, which drives population distribution from rural to urban areas, which really raises the labor cost for coffee production. And for the economic aspect, because the coffee price is controlled by the global market, the farmers have been facing challenges in volatile coffee prices. But they have some good practices in overcoming these challenges. For example, this is really easily understandable example of shade tree planting in the coffee areas. So because of the raising the temperature, the coffee production will be impacted. But because of this kind of the shade trees, this can buffer the impacts of climate change by the reducing ground temperature for 4 to 5 degrees in the daytime. And also, these shade trees can work as on-farm carbon storage. However, not all the farmers have ability to do this, and this has been practiced in several farmers, but not everybody in the Vietnamese coffee production areas. So I tried to compare the conventional farming practices and the sustainable farming practices relating to their interactions between climate, nature, and the implications to the farmers. On the left-hand side, it shows the interactions between these 4 elements in the conventional farming, and the right-hand side shows the interactions in the sustainable farming. So from this, you can see that the conventional farming will contribute to climate change by GHG emission, and the climate will exacerbate damage on the conventional farming. And the climate and conventional farming both drive the loss of nature. And because of this, the farmers needs more investment on their kind of maintaining coffee production. And on the right-hand side, you can see that if the farmers adopt the sustainable practices, which can reduce impacts or the negative impacts on nature, and also reduce GHG emission. And due to that, the nature will contribute to the climate change mitigation and adaptation. And possibly, hypothetically, this can benefit farmers more. And this is kind of a hypothetical situation. So to realize this, there's widespread adoption of certification in the coffee sector in Vietnam, which is usually called the supply chain approach, which adopts the sustainability standards, and they also do the manage the chain of custody to enhance traceability of the certified coffee, and also do the labeling and price premium from this certified coffee. As you can see in the diagram on the left-hand side, this certification deals with the individual farmers, and usually the capable and large-scale farmers have more opportunity to join this certified supply chain. But as I said, the low-capable farmers like ethnic minorities have less a chance to get into this kind of supply chain, and are relatively likely to be marginalized from this kind of supply chain. And as a result, as you can see in the diagram on the right-hand side, the certified sustainable farm can be seen in the patchy pattern, not like in the entire landscape. So which has less kind of contribution to improving the environment in the landscape level. So facing these challenges, there is a new approach to make the change more transformative and scalable, which is called the landscape approach, which basically looks at the farms in more wider scale, in the landscape scale, like district and provincial scales. And in this scale, they do the landscape due diligence mechanism and the multi-stakeholder governance. And they also try to invite the investment from different stakeholders in the area, like the fertilizer companies and the machineries companies, so that the action can be scalable to the landscape scale. So with that, we try to compare the kind of the contribution of this new the landscape approach with the certification approach by studying farmers in the area. And this is the results of the preliminary survey which we conducted earlier last year. So it's very small to see in the diagram, but the one represents the certified farmers, and the central two indicates the farmers in the landscape approach areas, and 3 indicates farmers in the areas without any intervention. So basically, the certified farmers have more capable to produce to get higher income from coffee production, as you can see there. And also, there is huge cost implications from sustainability practices, as you can see in the diagram in the right-hand side. The labor cost is the largest, but usually sustainable practices requires more labor. So it has huge implications to the labor cost for the sustainable practice in the coffee producers. So what I showed in the previous slide is results from the preliminary survey, but we are trying to go into more depth on this aspect with more higher number of samples to investigate the relationship between different practices and outcomes for the economic and the environmental and the social aspects in Vietnam. So these are some take-home messages, which I think I can present in the panel discussion later, because this is time for me to end my presentation. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you, Yasuo-san. Thank you so much for joining our panel, and really interesting to see this contrast between supply chain approach and landscape approach. And I'd like to hear your comments on those questions, of course, in a later panel. So I'd like to introduce the second presenter, who is Zhu Hui from Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences. So, right, yours.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's my great, thanks, Chairman, and it's my great pleasure to be here and thanks the organizer to invite me here and exchange some views on the food security and climate change. And I came from Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences, and my institute called the Institute of the Environment. And could you put down? Oh, how can I use it? This is down, this is up. Yeah, okay, yeah. So the name of our institute is Working on the Environment and Sustainable Development, and located in Beijing. And we are ranked the first one in China working on the agricultural environment issues. And nearly about 20 employees working in our institute and different research area. And I came from agricultural meteorological division. We also working on water saving technologies and also the agricultural ecology, and include the biodiversity of different kind of crop variety, and environmental engineer of the livestock and the plants. Also some of the materials, new materials such as nano technology, how to increase the pesticide efficiency on pest. And today, I just would like to introduce some of the issues on climate change. Oh, this is our institute introduction, the 5 divisions working on the agriculture environment issues. And when we talk about climate issues, we can get ideas from our daily life. And the up one, the right, you can see a face located in the soil. Here is used to be a reservoir. It is just about, because of the climate warming, it is dry up. So the fish all died and located in the soil. And we also face some of the problem of the land degradation. And you can see the bottom one, it is paddy field because it is about water scarcity. The paddy field already cracker. So it is difficult for some farmers to get some of the harvest, good harvest during the drought year. And the other issues that is the new phenomena for us. When we're talking about climate change, we usually think temperature is warming, but this is the bottom one. It is happened in the later spring. You can call it a cold spell in later spring. And it is happened in May. Usually you can consider in China, in May, it's usually very warm weather. But in that year, it is 2015 in northwest China, and the grape plants were all died just because of the cold spell in later spring. So because of climate change, we encounter some of the disasters we never met before. So we have to consider how to make sure we still have the food sufficient for ourselves. But the security is always the top priority for the Chinese government. So what we would like to, working on the agriculture sectors, we want to have some good opportunity and good technology to work together with farmers and tell them how to take the technology in their reality. Field management, use the different kind of research methods, such as we do the real field experiment, just so the farmers demonstrate what the technology is useful for them to adopt it and to increase their income just because they could get the better the crop production. And we also use some of the crop models to tell the policymakers how about you look like the food production in the next 20 years or maybe next 50 years, and make sure that the society still have the capacity to sustainable development. And the other method we use is the phase experiment is called free air of carbon dioxide enrichment facilities. It is just look like how about the future, because when we talk about climate change, we also think the CO2 will increase so much. But for agriculture, you can see it is better for the photosynthesis of the crop growth. So we do some the special facility, just want to do some the agriculture research on the future conditions for crop growth. And when we just give a quick look of what the impact of climate change on agriculture production, the green color of the right side, it is just represent the major crop produce area in China. But if you say the left side, it is just the analysis the drought trend during the last 50 years. If we put the two fingers together, overlap them, we can get some ideas that in the north part or maybe in the major that agriculture area of China will suffer some serious drought during the last 50 years. So it is so big problem for the China that the food security, and because you will encounter and suffering the different kind of meteorological disasters. Just take an example of the drought here. We also encounter the different kind of disasters such as flood and the drought and heat wave and some of the cold spell and frost, etc. But the first important one is the drought in China. So we put much energy and the research on the drought analysis, how we adapt the drought issues. So we have some technology already used on the field. It is in practice, and such as we call it different kind of the water saving technologies. Use the different kind of irrigation scheme, irrigation style, and irrigation method, and such as sprinkle, dripping irrigation, and also the hill irrigation, furrow irrigation, and also build some of the infrastructure. It is called the ditch irrigation channel, just to make the people have the more accessible to the water for irrigation. And the other measures is the local agriculture structure, and which crop may be suitable for different area. So we choose the different kind of planting system and also the different kind of variety. So we also introduce some cultivation agriculture. It is reduced tillage or zero tillage. But this method is some problem in reality. Usually the farmers just maybe in the first 3 years, you couldn't get some positive the production in the first 3 years or 5 years. The farmers doesn't like it. So we just show them from our research, maybe in the later 5 years, you can get the benefit for the long term in your agricultural production. Also, we give some new ideas how to choose the better varieties for the cold, for the drought situation to the farmers. So this is just take an example in the northeast China and for the rice breeding. Because in our mind, when you consider climate change, you really think that you should have the cold resistance, the varieties. And also we have found the other characters of the rice breeding. You have to find the fast and about the feeding rate. This means you can get the good production just even in the frost earlier days for the rice production. The other one is, this is a new idea which introduced some technology such as dripping irrigation on rice. We got some good results and maybe good production on rice planting. But this is, you have to consider the cost effectiveness. This technology is useful, but if you go to the farmers, talk to them, you should take this one because the water scarcity and the drought is very frequent, maybe intensity in future. But the question is, the farmer couldn't adopt it because of economic issue. So when we do some adaptation, first choice, you have to consider the cost and the benefit to the farmers. Yeah, and when we talk adaptation, we want to synergy of the mitigation and adaptation together. So this is just take an example of the grassland, because grassland is so important for livestock. And this is solar energy. Just use it in remote area because there is no electricity. accessible. So this is, we use it in the Tibetan plateau to irrigate our grassland. We just look after our grassland like we look after our cropland. So this is ideal just because climate change, we make sure we still have the good food for the livestock, the grassland. The next one is we use some of the current good technology, modern technology, we call it Internet of Things. We set up this facility in different circumstances, such as papaya and such as some fruit. Usually this technology could be used in the case crop with the high values because it needs the high technology to use this facility in operation, just to make sure they have the ideas what the climate and what the weather looks like, whether they will meet some of the disasters, give some early warning for the plant growth. So when we do this adaptation, we also do some case studies because adaptation technology is always regional and local level. So for farmers, we do some case study in the northwest of China, it is in Ningxia. And for farmer levels, we give the list of what options they can consider for their better income, just because of the agriculture planting. And we also give some suggestions to the government officer, what the activity they should take considered for future climate risk. And because for the government, they have a different perspective, not just for next 5 years. They should consider maybe next 10 years, and especially for the big infrastructure building. So for different stakeholders, we give different advice. And you have different, a lot of long list of the options. So which one is more effectiveness? We just set up a matrix. We call it a multi-criteria method, and what indicator you should understand and consider for you when you decide and what measures you will take. You should have the top one, and maybe each one you should take the priority in your action, adaptation action. So we just set up the multi-criteria to analysis, prioritize the different kind of the options. And this is table just mainly for the government, because big actions should depend on the government responsibility. And when we take the adaptations, we also encountered some challenge. Challenge is so complicated, such as water scarcity, water irrigation, whether it is available, because you always compete over the water availability with the industry, with the livelihood and agriculture. Agriculture usually put the less attention if you consider in a society level. So water scarcity always put the top priority. And then the other is about land degradation, also the local economic level, whether they can adopt the new technology. Do they have the ability to use it? So we also do some surveys with talking with the villagers and do set up some questionnaires. And I'm here, yeah. And during the winter season, because most of the farmers, they don't have some much work on field. So we do some of the village survey, just talking with the farmers, what they need if they encounter the meteorological disaster. Do they understand what is climate looks like? Do they have some ideas to prepare for their countermeasures? So this is, we do some of the village survey at the local level. And here you can see our results when we give some constraint to options like the farmer to choose. The first choice, most of the farmers, they have totally agree the first lack of the money. So this is, they think if I have the money, I can do everything I could to address the climate disaster. It doesn't problem. We have already ability of the technology. The labor is not the, yeah, okay. So this is just some of the ideas we're talking with the farmers. We also do some research with the international, with some of the international society. Doesn't work. Okay, we're also working with some international cooperation, and just because currently some technology is already available now, how to use it, and also we want to know how to about make it could adopt by the farmers for the adopted by the policymakers. So this is the last one. I just would like to share with our expert here. First one is we want to set up some smart field management, increased the water using efficiency, fertilizer using efficiency, also low carbon agriculture, and link with the mitigation and adaptation together. And then the last one is we would like to increase the produce, the value chain, make the farmers could get better profit in agricultural production system. Okay, still, we just keep in mind stand with farmers, make sure they have a good income and the production. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Juhui, for very comprehensive presentation. I'd like to hear more in the panel discussion from your insights. So our next speaker is Mr. Mameishi Shinjiro, who's from JICA Ogata Sadako Research Institute for Peace and Development. And I believe that his talk is based upon his long-standing experience in JICA practice. So Mameishi-san, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes. Again, so my name is Shinjiro Amameshi. I'm from the JICA. Although I belong to the JICA Ogata Sadako Research Institute, but I'm not originally the researchers, implementers, practitioners. JICA is implementation agencies of the official development assistance under the Japanese government. So today's focusing area, geographical focusing area is Asia and Pacific, but my background is Africa. So I have been involved in the agriculture development in Africa in the past more than 15 years. So I'd like to today take up the situation in Africa. Yes, title is Resilient Food Systems in Agriculture Development in Africa. Next, please. It is a trend of the number of the frequencies on the extreme disasters in Africa. So due to time limitations, I don't go in detail, but you can easily find that from the 1990s, since 1990s, the number of the extreme disaster increased, and so Africa is facing the negative impact of the climate change. Next, please. And it is from the World Food Program. Yes, food insecurity, climate change. Yes, present means the situation in 2015. The Africa and Asia. You can easily see that the Africa and Asia are considered as the vulnerable from the food insecurity perspective. So if the emission level is high and the adaptation is known, the situation becomes seriously deteriorated. And the emission level becomes low, and adaptation measures, a lot of adaptation measures are taken. But the situation is almost the same level in the 2015. Next, please. And in Africa, there is a flagship, the Agricultural Development Program called Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Programs. It is promoted by the African Union and African Union Development Agency. It is called the ODA NEPAD. Yes, it is a flagship. Each African countries are expected to promote the agricultural development based on CAADP. The CAADP was formulated in 2003, and that time the CAADP focused on the production and food security. But it was reviewed in 2014, and the CAADP set up the 7 commitment. And it is a new commitment. And one of the commitment is enhancing the resilience to climate variabilities, resilience to climate-related risks, and investment in resilience building. Next, please. However, the African Unions are publishing the biannual report every 2 years, and it is a latest one. The progress of CAADP is not on track. Yes, the African government don't put the sufficient priorities on the agriculture development. And the CAADP requires stronger political leadership and commitment. And regarding climate change, climate variability pose a significant threat in the context of the agricultural development in Africa. The continent, yes, Africa, must accelerate the progress towards the building a climate-resilient African food system. Next, please. Yes, and I'd like to introduce a very interesting report published by the FAO. Yes, State of the Food and Agriculture, making agri-food systems more resilient to shocks and stresses. It is not just for the Africa, all over the world, but the one of the most heavily impacted region is Africa. So in order to secure nutrition and livelihood of millions of people, agri-food systems must become more resilient. And the absorptive capacity, yes, this report raised the 5 resilient capacities, that is prevention, anticipation, absorption, adaptation, and transformation. Among these 5 resilient capacities, the absorption capacity is very critical in confronting forcing shocks, mainly the climate change. And the key to building the absorption ability is diversification, diversity in food sources, diversity of actors, yes, small-scale farmers to the middleman, yes, processors, yes, a diversity of the actors in the food supply chain, and redundant and robust transport network, and affordability of the healthy diet for all. And yes, risk management strategies. Risk management means just like the risk assessment, the weather forecast, and early warning system, and early action plan. Yes, these risk management strategies are required. Next, please. Yes, and yes, this report strengthens the importance of the government support to develop small and medium agri-food enterprises, cooperatives, consortia, and clusters, as well as the social protection program. Yes, in order to diversify the actors, yes, government support is required. Next is also the resilience capacity of the rural low-income household, in particular small-scale farmers, can be significantly strengthened through education, non-farm employment, and cash transfer. Yes, I really think that the peoples who are negatively, seriously affected by the climate change is small-scale farmers. Yes, the capacity development of the small-scale farmer is very, very important. And ensuring the economic access to sufficient food for all, for healthy diet at all times, very important. And building the resilient food system should be a key policy objectives. Yes, and building the resilient agri-food system should be put in the center in the policy. And mainstream the resilience in agri-food policies, and the greater coordination across relevant sectors and relevant actors. Yes, and yes. Next, please. As I said, the JICA is not a research organization. JICA is implementation agency under the Japanese government. So it is a JICA's cooperation policies in agricultural development in Africa. Yes, JICA aims to protect people's lives, livelihood, dignities, and support building capacities of people, organizations, and societies, and create resilient societies. Yes, these are related to the human security. We are putting biggest priority on the human securities. Yes, we set up the JICA Africa Food Security Initiative. Yes, due to time limitation, I don't explain about everything of the JICA Africa Food Security Initiative. It is composed of 4 pillars based on the definition of the food security, that is availability, access, and utilization of stabilities. Yes, climate change is related to stability. So I pick up just our cooperation in the context of stabilities, climate change. It is a just example. Sorry, next page. Yes, I want to explain about our cooperation on the stability. Stability is related to climate change. Yes, one is the agricultural insurance. Yes, it is a project in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is also negatively affected by the climate change. Yes, we try to introduce agricultural insurance in collaboration with private insurance companies. Yes, if the small-scale farmers pay the small amount of the premium, so once something happens, yes, precipitation, rainfall doesn't reach to the certain level, so they can get the insurance money. And the next one is a participatory irrigation development. Yes, without water, the farmer don't produce anything. Yes, we try to promote the irrigation development in participatory manners of the farmers. Okay, that's all. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you so much, Amame-san. It's wonderful to have somebody who are aware about their practice and who are really been on the ground as a practitioner for this session, simply because we have this strong policy orientation for our project, and we plan to communicate with policy makers and practitioners in the coming years. So I'm really happy to have you today. And also, lessons from Africa should be also useful and instrumental when we think about policy making in the Asia-Pacific region as well. Okay, so our final speaker is Professor Tommaso Ferrando from University of Antwerp, who is joining us online. So Tommaso, could you, oh yes, hello. Thank you so much for joining us in the early morning. And yeah, without further ado, please turn your microphone on, and I think he can share PowerPoint for yourself, or I'm not sure about the arrangement, but okay. Right, so floor is yours, Tommaso.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, and good afternoon, everyone. I would have definitely loved to be with you, but unfortunately, teaching schedule didn't allow me. But thanks a lot for the invitation. So I will not take too much of your time. I just want to shift the attention to what next. So what do we do? I think that was already mentioned very clearly. Food security and climate change are intertwined. Food insecurity is a political condition, and I really appreciated the reference to Amartya Sen. So we often hear that something has to be done, and luckily something will be done, and that has to do also with financing. So financing the sustainable transition and financing a food system that is adaptive and resilient, and at the same time capable of mitigating the impact on climate change. So increasingly, and I think that the colleague from JICA just mentioned insurance, recently the conversation has shifted towards financing the sort of climate and food nexus. So I hope that, especially if you're thinking about going and proposing policy points and having a dialogue with policymakers, it would be important to get a sense of what is going on, what are the main trends, and what may be the problems. So as a take-home message, which is the way in which I always start my presentation, I would say three main things. The first one that I would like you to pay attention to is that financing climate change and financing around climate change is not new. And at the same time, also financing food systems and the financing of the transition or sustainable food system is not new. However, what is important is to ask ourselves what kind of finance and for what purpose and what are the implications on food systems, and to make sure that prioritizing adaptation and mitigation to climate change doesn't result in food systems that are not fair, are not equitable, and are not based on human rights. So, as I was mentioning, I will share the slides so you don't really have to pay too much attention to the details. But we're increasingly talking about the need to finance a transition for a food system that is increasingly affected by climate change. And this is the reality, as was mentioned earlier on. It's the reality in China, it's the reality in the African continent, but it's also the reality here in Belgium, where for the last years, droughts and excessive weather events have significantly affected the food system and the livelihood of farmers, but also the life of eaters and consumers who don't have access to the same amount of food that they were used to. So it is the reality, it's not something of the future, and it is a significant reality, especially in the most vulnerable and most fragile countries. So what to do? Well, increasingly there is, as I was saying, this idea of financing and finding finance for the transition. And as much as we certainly all agree with the fact that the transition has to be financed, the question is which finance and who calls the shot. So who decides what is financed and what is not financed. And one narrative that often is deployed, and it is at the national level and at the international level, is that there is not enough public funds, that there is not enough money in order to finance this transition. And this could open up a whole conversation and debate, and I hope that you have it later on. But this specific approach comes from a point of view that recognizes that public tools are limited when it comes to raising funds. So we start from the assumption that countries have no capacity of fiscal leverage, they cannot impose taxation, they cannot redefine their internal financial dynamics, but also starts from the assumption that the commitment that countries in the global north undertook in Paris in 2015, so the 100 billion per year, is not fulfilled. So there are a lot of assumptions that take us to the fact that there is not enough public money. But then the fact that there is not enough public money means moving towards private money. And that is where I believe the problem arises. Why is that? Because more private money means and implies more financialization of the food and climate nexus. And for financialization, I mean the situation where financial interest and financial instruments are those that are shaping the system that we're talking about. So by opening up to private finance, we are opening up the climate and food nexus to considerations that investors, asset managers, private equity funds make, which may not align with the assumptions and with the objectives that policymakers, civil society organizations, farmers, or people living in conditions of marginalization are putting forward. So there may be a divergence. And this is where, again, the issue may arise, especially when investments are based on the desire and the aspiration of significant returns versus investments that are made in the name of adaptation, mitigation, human rights, and food security. So is it new? As I said, not that much. So the financing and the financialization of the climate agenda is the way in which the global governance for climate has been structured, at least for the last 40, 45 years. Schemes like the Kyoto Protocol and carbon accounting, but also REDD+ and carbon credits are based on financial transactions to the point that there are global markets for these titles. But we see also in the terms of climate an increase in financial instruments and financial products. I'm sure that you all heard about green bonds, and then there are the blue bonds, but then there are also increasingly sophisticated financial products, including insurance, as was mentioned, that are bringing in private capital and risk management through the lenses of climate change adaptation and mitigation. If you think about all of these forms of financing, they are usually discussed as climate finance, but it's clear that they already have an impact on the food system. So one first suggestion is to always pay attention when climate finance is presented as such to the impact that they can have on food systems, and think, for example, of REDD+, of payments for ecosystem services, and other forms of financial transactions. They are presented as climate finance, but they definitely have an impact on local dynamics of food production and distribution. So climate finance and food finance may not be that dissimilar. On the other hand, we also have to recognize that financing of the agri-food system is not new itself. And there are several accounts in the last decades where we see an increased attention on the financial sector vis-a-vis food systems. And so more money coming into the food system from the financial sector. What is different is that so far, or at least till the last years, we've been seeing this capital entering to the food system without any specific transition or any specific sustainability and transformation purpose. Now, in the last years, there is this idea that private finance can contribute, or is actually the contributor to the transition. And there are large asset managers and large financial institutions that are pooling capital in the realm of the billions in organizations that are then investing in the food system for transition. And one of the most famous is FAIRR, FAIRR, which is actually bringing together actors like BlackRock and Vanguard, and then supporting them into investing in the food system. So if there is money coming into the food system for the transition, why may it be problematic, and why I think that someone who is interested in global governance and someone who is interested in global environmental strategy should pay attention to that. Several reasons. Definitely this shift from the public to the private. Secondly, financialization means financing projects and food systems and transition that are financially rentable and remunerative for the investors. These may not be the priorities for the people on the ground, but this also may not be the priorities for farmers. It clearly, the privatization and the financialization of the food system clearly lead to a change in the role of the public. There is not anymore policymaker, there is not anymore regulator, but becomes a sort of insurer or de-risker, to use the words of Daniela Gabor, of private activities. So we may talk to policymakers and regulators hoping that they can do something for food security and the transition, but at the end of the day, what they're doing is they're just insuring investments of the private sector. And then I think by leaving private sector on the command deck, what happens is that, as I said before, they define which kind of transition, they define which kind of food system, they define which kind of adaptation, which kind of mitigation, and that can significantly silence or invisibilize alternatives, invisibilize solutions that are locally rooted, that are based on reality and experiences of the people, and that may not be bankable or financially viable. So if something is not financially viable, if they cannot generate the return that investors are interested in, they don't get the money, and that means that somehow they have to give space to other alternatives. So we need to talk about the food, climate, and finance nexus, and there are plenty of ways in which we can look at that really from farm to fork. So finance is intervening, private finance is intervening at all levels of the food system, financing what they consider to be the transition for the food and climate systems that that they believe is the best, but then again, that they believe is the best. And some of the examples will come in the next slides, and then if we have time for Q&A, I can expand on them. I don't want to take too much of your time on this. But one way in which financial capital is already intervening, and well, before I talk about the fact that the climate, the international finance is putting money into sustainability, it is important also to remember that at the same time that finance is proposing itself as the solution to the problem, finance keeps investing, financial actors keep investing money in commodity markets that are actually driving a lot of the food insecurity and have been driving the food insecurity for many years in the past, exacerbating already existing crises. So it is also important that when we think about finance, we don't only look at what finance is proposing as the solutions, but it's also, we recognize that the financial capital is also invested in many other activities, including fossil fuel, including all those activities that are exacerbating climate change and that are driving food insecurity. But this is not the story that finance is telling us. Finance is telling us the story of how they are investing in the transition. So how is finance intervening? Well, one part of the story is the story of large-scale climate agri investments for biodiversity conservation, protection, for the generation of carbon credits, and for the carbon markets. As I said, these are presented as climate intervention, but then if you look at the picture, you understand that that's land that could have been used for food security, that could have been used for local agri-food projects, that could have been used in ways that also involve the production of food for the local territories. And this is one of the critiques that is often raised against these large-scale projects, is that they significantly impact local food security by shifting territories that are combining both food production and other forms of services and value, collective value generation, into territories that only have to capture carbon and to be used for carbon credits. Talking about carbon capturing, another way in which finance is significantly intervening is by pushing farmers into carbon capturers themselves. So by saying farmers should be rewarded for capturing carbon, which someone can say, well, that's not particularly problematic. That's actually what we want. But then it depends which farmers have access to that, and also which technologies are deployed, and whether or not this carbon capturing through the soil is actually a long-term strategy, or it is, as it's happening in the United States, just a one-off every year, which doesn't really have any long-term, so it's not, it doesn't guarantee any continuity, but even more is leading to an increased concentration in land. So by financing carbon capturing, what we're seeing is the increased size of the farms, the disappearance of farmers, all in the name of capturing carbon and climate change mitigation. A third way, very, very popular, is that of financing the so-called smart agriculture transit or shift. This means that private finance identify one specific way of doing agriculture, which is highly robotized, highly technological, dependent on investments, dependent on satellites, that harvest data and that provides data to few companies that are the owners of the patents and the owners of the softwares. But that may be an interesting way of doing agriculture. The point is that from the ground in many parts of the world, this has been significantly criticized, and for various reasons. But the point is, if we let private finance decide in which kind of transition for the agri-climate nexus, this is probably the direction that we're going, and we are not going into directions like agroecology, territorial markets, biodiversity, and agro-intercropping or regenerative agriculture, which are not totally aligned with this very modernist and technology-based agriculture. And then it was mentioned already, more derivatives, more insurances, more financial products. And a little bit the idea is to support farmers in the transition by providing them financial tools, which may be seen a way of kind of empowering them, but there is significant research, and Ryan Isaacson is someone who's been writing a lot about it, that says that actually it exacerbates dependency, it exacerbates diversity and frictions among farmers. Only few farmers can access it, and farmers get indebted, by getting indebted, they have to change their agricultural practices in order to produce more food. In a context where value chains are not really remunerating farmers, we are telling farmers that they can take a financial product and that will help them in the adaptation, but we also see that that leads to the intensification of the same unsustainable practices that we would like to avoid, and that's just because of the fact that a lot of small-scale farmers are not making enough money in order to survive, let alone repaying financial instruments. So to conclude on the negative part, or to say the concerns part, we need to pay attention to the way in which the private sector and private actors maybe define the climate food agenda for the future. And I think that that's for at least two main reasons. The first one is that private sector can finance without having to wait for the public sector to regulate and define what is good and what is bad. And I think that maybe it's time for the policymakers and for all of us academics and in practice to ask ourselves the question is whether or not that should happen, but also because climate and food finance is changing food systems, is changing forms of production. And I think that we, in the name of principles and values like human rights, but also the commitment to common but differentiated responsibilities, we cannot just push for climate adaptation and mitigation when we know that this is going to significantly impact and negatively impact the reality on the ground of farmers and food system. So what could be a different approach, but that's really a complete different set of an intervention. But I think that it is important to recognize what the high-level panel of experts on food and nutrition security is telling us, which is we need to put agency at the center of our understanding of food security. And agency means empowering the people on the ground. It means empowering peasants, fisher folks, and workers, and not subordinating them to the needs and wills of international financial capital. And so if we put that at the center, inevitably we bring in the human rights perspective, and in particular the right to food, the right to a healthy environment. They're telling us that the transition has to be respectful of these obligations that countries have undertaken. And so we cannot accept that financial instruments are deployed if they are not going in that direction. And then if we want to be even more ambitious, we can bring in notions of climate justice and food justice that tell us that redistribution is essential. And one thing that clearly doesn't happen when financial capital is involved is the distribution of resources, because at the end of the day, financial capital is interested in investing in the climate and food nexus to obtain more resources and to privatize and close more resources, not to redistribute them, because their business model is about generation of revenues. And so these are like three ways in which we can think about it: food security according to the HLPE, human rights, justice. But then I think at the end of the day, the starting conversation that maybe you can have also in Japan and in the other places where you're in contact with policymaker is really what kind of role for the public and what kind of role for public interest and public action and public agency in defining the agenda for climate and food. Unfortunately, it looks like it is a shrinking space. But I think that not all hopes are lost, and I'm sure that with this workshop, with the work that you are doing, the conversation can definitely be continued in Japan and in the other countries, and I'm definitely more than interested in continuing this conversation also across countries and here in Belgium. To that extent, this is my email, so please feel free to reach out.
Hi, thank you so much, Tommaso, and I hope you can keep the video on so that we can see you during the discussion. And yeah, thanks so much for drawing our attention to some of the broader context that we have in food security and climate change governance, and especially it's interesting to see that, how this shift from public fund to private fund has a deep implication to the different aspects of policy making. My apologies for my bad time management. We have remaining 15 minutes time. And I was planning to do the round of our panel discussion with pre-prepared guiding questions. But I think if I do that, I will spend up all the remaining time, and I hope the session could be more interesting if it's interactive. So if you have any questions from the floor at this stage, rather than moving to the panel discussion, I can take those questions to the panelists. So if you have any, please raise your hand. Actually, no, for now. Then I can really go to the pre-prepared questions. So we have 40 minutes. So I think I can put those questions put together so that we can really do it in time. So I have two questions to the distinguished panelists. One is, what are the impacts of climate change on food security governance we should be aware of, and what are the key risks and possibilities? So here we're not just speaking about food security itself, but food security governance, either it can be a national level or a global level, and what sort of impacts that climate change might have on this governance structure that we should be aware of when we are making up policy implications from this research. And the second question will be, what are the legal, institutional, or policy approaches that are needed to ensure a resilient food system under the climate crisis? So these two questions actually go hand in hand. So hope you can share your insights on these questions. So I'd like to start with Yasuo with these questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I forgot to mention. So please limit yourself within 3 minutes as we can switch it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's going to be very tough. No. Yeah, the question is about the impact of climate change on food security governance, not the food security itself. So I think the answer could be different depending on how we interpret this question. For example, in my case in coffee, the climate action have some impacts on the food security governance. For example, the EU deforestation regulation really focuses on procurement of coffee from non-deforested areas, and which makes the assessment of non-deforestation in the coffee field really costly. And this has huge implication for the farmers in the producing areas. So in that case, in that way, the sustainable production has very strong cost implication that should be kind of taken care by the appropriate governance mechanism. And yeah, as I said in my presentation, there are multiple the interactions between the climate, nature, and food security and farmers' income. So the government needs to take care of these multiple interactions that can be really challenged. And also, we have to also look at the supply chain and also the landscape level. So these 2 points needs to be balanced in making effective interventions for making transition. Yeah, I think that's.
Thank you. Then the same question for Ju Hui.
Sorry. So I just would like to raise two key issues and consider the first question, how about the governance working on the food security or climate change impact? And in my mind, when we're talking about food security, we will pay more attention on the crop production. But if we're talking about climate change, we should keep in mind food security is not just crop production. The people always would like to have the higher and the good living stations and the living standards. So they when possible will need more, such as the dairy, more meat. So the crop production, not just for people, you have to consider you still have the sufficient production for the livestock, for the poultry. So this is first one. So this is for the traditional ideas, you have to produce more just to meet the people living standards, the requirement. So this is first issue. And the second one is when we're talking about food security, we also have to consider the nutrition security, because when we do some research on the impact of climate change, and we found that nutrition in the crops production decreased. So when you have the maybe hair production, you should have to consider how about the nutrition in your harvest crops. So this is second issue. Food security is not just the production, it also related to the nutrition. So this is second issue. And maybe the third issue is when we talk about the food security, you have to consider the different kind of the food type, such as wild food. Mushroom, maybe they live in mountain area, in a remote area, and the people lived on, such as some wild food for the rural people, and they just rely on the wild food. So this is another option for the food security issue. So this is some I think the governance should just broad the ideas on the food security, different kind of the food, and also consider maybe the depths of the nutrition of the new livestock. This is for the people, maybe better life. This is for the first question. I got some idea on this issue. And for the second one is the legal and institution method, the mechanism, how to just ensure the resilience of the food system. And in our mind, because when we do some drought resistance actions, just adaptation on the drought, you will find different government offices, they just working on the same issue. They also all working on the water saving technologies from different departments, such as water resources department, also agriculture and rural affairs department. So this is called some project that they repeated so much. We give some suggestion, maybe do case study at the local level we set up, and maybe we suggest them to set up some focal point, just combining different department action together, give the big plans just at the local level. But they still have some argument who take the first position of this focal point management office. So when we do some of the governance and the legal, maybe this is possibly who is the leader position on these adaptation activities. So this is some idea come to my mind, and maybe we need some of the focal point at the local level. They just in charge of the low agriculture, such agriculture adaptation measures, and just spend the money wisely. Yeah, this is some of the suggestions that come to my mind. Maybe we can discuss later. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. You're touching upon important aspects of who should take authority to set up on this complex policy issue. Amame-san, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I'd like to talk about it in the context of the Africa. And yes, climate change is negatively influencing to the all levels. For example, the individual level. Yes, the predecessor. Yes, Ju-san, as Ju-san said. Yes, it is. The people on the ground negatively influenced, so that their income and their nutrition level become low, deteriorated, and at the national level, yes, African countries, a lot of African countries dependent on the food import. And if the climate change becomes more serious, they have to spend much more money to import the grains from foreign countries. And what I want to say is the most important things is in order to enhance the production capacities in each countries. And in order to realize it, yes, the capacities of the farmers should be strengthened. So each African government should further strengthen the agriculture development, in particular the extension. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And last but not least, Tommaso, could you share your insights on these questions?
Yeah, very briefly. And I think that Europe is a very good example of how climate change is now connected with agriculture and very much central to the ongoing policies at the European level. You probably saw the images of tractors taking over Brussels and the protests around Europe. And if you didn't, I invite you to look at what the farmers have been doing. And it's interesting to see how part of those farmers are, well, all the farmers are blaming climate change for what is happening, for reduction in production and for their conditions. But then farmers are raising other points. Some are saying, well, there is not enough money, we're not paid enough, there is free trade, and so on and so forth. But some farmers are saying, because of climate change, we cannot respect environmental measures anymore. And so we should be freed from having to set land aside, and we should be freed from having climate measures, and it's not up to us to support the transition. And so you see how the same issue, the relationship between climate and food, gets interpreted very different by different parties. So one part of the farmers is saying, against climate change, we should just produce more and not care about the environment. While another part of the farmers is saying, because of climate change, we should shift towards agroecology, we should shift towards sustainable regenerative practices, and we need public support, and we need public money, we need guaranteed prices. And the point is, which one of the two will win? And so it's not anymore an issue of scientifically and objectively addressing the problem, it's politically making the choice between one or the other. So both climate change and food become political issues, as Amartya Sen was already saying last century. And the point is, at the moment, it seems that Europe is only listening one side of the story, which is those of the farmers that are saying we cannot do environmental measures. And so they suspended the 4% fallow land requirement. They are facilitating production, all of that. And that's really my last point, in the name of productivity, which I also heard a little bit from the previous presentation, as if the issue was producing more, without caring or without recognizing that there is at the moment enough food and enough calories and enough nutrition to feed more than 11 billion people, and we're only between 7 and 8 billion people in the world. And as you were saying at the beginning, forgetting that it's an issue of distribution and not an issue of production. And so I think that now is really the moment where we either listen to Amartya Sen and we either listen to the people that have been saying for so long that it is about access, it is about resources and finance, and then we go there, or we listen to the people saying it's about availability, so production or global trade. And so we go in a completely different direction. And I think that climate change is intensifying that political debate, and it's very good that we are having it now.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the very strong statement that it's everything about political issues that we're talking about, climate change and food security. And I think in my interpretation of your comment is that we researchers who are studying this broad landscape of food security or climate change governance has a maybe new role to engage with public and politics and public sphere so that we can really make this change happen. Somehow, yeah, it was a really nice conclusion of our workshop. I think we have just 2 minutes, so we can really quickly wrap up for the day. So thank you so much for the Thank you so much. I just wanted to confirm that whether I can really conclude the 4 days. So thank you so much for your active participation. And I really want to thank all the panelists, both on the session 1 and session 2. And special thanks to Tommaso who joined online in the early morning. Please have a good day there. And I hope that we can keep our interaction in the coming years. All right, so that concludes the day, and thank you so much for your participation. Bye-bye.